In the remote stretches of the Appalachian Mountains, there lies a secluded village called Whispering Pines. Known for its dense forests and the eerie quiet that blankets the area, Whispering Pines has long been the source of local legends and ghost stories. But for Jake Carlson, a writer with a penchant for the supernatural, it was the perfect setting for his next book. Jake arrived in Whispering Pines one crisp autumn afternoon, his car stirring up clouds of fallen leaves as he drove down the narrow, winding roads. The village was smaller than he'd imagined, with only a handful of weathered buildings and a single, dimly lit diner that seemed to serve as the hub for the town's vast population. As Jake stepped into the diner, the chatter inside ceased abruptly. All eyes turned toward him, their expressions a mix of curiosity and wariness. He offered a friendly nod and made his way to the counter, where an elderly woman with sharp blue eyes and a tight bun of grey hair greeted him. "What can I get for YA, stranger?" she asked, her voice carrying a hint of an unplaceable accent. "Coffee, black, and any information you can give me about the local legends," Jake replied, pulling out a small recorder and a notebook from his bag. The woman eyed the recorder warily but began pouring coffee into a chipped ceramic mug. "You're one of those writers, huh? We've had a few like you before. Never end up staying long." Jake smiled, taking the mug. "I plan to stick around a bit. I'm particularly interested in the stories about the woods. Anything you can tell me?" The woman sighed, glancing around the diner before leaning closer. "You want the stories? Fine. But be careful, some things in these woods are left undisturbed. Folks say the woods whisper at night, that they call out to certain people. Those who answer usually don't come back." Intrigued, Jake pressed her for more details. She told him of shadows that moved against the wind, lights with no source that appeared between the trees, and an old legend of a creature that guarded the heart of the forest. Every story was more bizarre and bone-chilling than the last. Armed with tales and warnings, Jake rented a small cabin on the edge of the village, overlooking the sprawling forest. That night, as darkness enveloped the world, Jake felt a palpable tension in the air, a silent invitation from the unknown. The next morning, armed with his camera, notebook, and a heavy flashlight, Jake ventured into the woods. The trees stood tall and close together, their branches forming a canopy so thick that little sunlight broke through. The deeper into the woods he went, the quieter it became, until all he could hear was his own breathing and the crunch of leaves underfoot. After hours of walking, Jake stumbled upon an old, overgrown path leading to a clearing. In the middle stood an ancient oak tree, its trunk wide and gnarled, roots twisting through the earth like serpents. It was an impressive sight, and Jake couldn't resist the urge to get closer. As he approached, a chill ran down his spine. The air around the tree was noticeably colder, and there was a faint whispering sound, like voices overlapping, too quiet to discern any words. Jake raised his camera, the lens focusing just as the air shifted. Suddenly, the whispers intensified, swirling around him, urgent and warning. Jake felt a hand on his shoulder, firm and cold. He spun around, flashlight raised, but there was nothing there, only the dense, pressing silence of the forest. Unnerved but determined, he pressed on, documenting every oddity. As night approached, he made his way back to the cabin, the feeling of being watched never quite leaving him. That night, the real terror began. Jake was jolted awake by a sound outside his cabin, a soft, rhythmic tapping. He grabbed his flashlight and peered out the window. In the beam of his light, he caught a glimpse of something moving at the edge of the woods, a figure, tall and thin, moving unnaturally quick between the trees. Heart-pounding, Jake watched as the figure stopped and turned toward him. Its eyes, if they could be called that, shone with a pale, eerie light. The tapping sound grew louder, more insistent. Fueled by both fear and curiosity, Jake made a decision that he could never take back. He opened the door of the cabin and stepped out into the darkness, his recorder in one hand and flashlight in the other, ready to confront whatever secrets Whispering Pines held. As he walked toward the edge of the woods, the figure vanished, the tapping stopped, and all that remained was the whispering wind, coiling deeper into the shadows. Jake followed, his recorder capturing every moment, the line between hunter and hunted blurring with each step he took. The forest seemed to close in around him, the trees like centenaries of the night. The ground beneath his feet was uneven, roots like gnarled fingers clutching at his boots. Jake's flashlight beam darted from one darkened tree to another, each shadow and rustle of leaves sending his heart into his throat. As he ventured deeper, the forest seemed to respond. Branches moved with no wind to stir them, and the air grew thick, heavy with the scent of decay. Jake paused, his breath clouding in the cold air, his skin prickled with goosebumps. The sensation of being watched was overwhelming, as if the forest itself had eyes, peering out from every dark corner. The eerie silence was suddenly broken by a low growl that seemed to come from all around him. Jake spun around, flashlight sweeping wildly through the trees, but there was nothing, only the endless, oppressive forest. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the growl stopped, replaced once again by the haunting silence. Jake pressed on, driven by a mix of fear and determination. He needed to understand what was happening, to capture it, to prove he wasn't imagining the impossible things he was witnessing. Hours seemed to pass as he wandered the labyrinthine woods. The night grew darker, if that were possible, and the temperature dropped further. Frost began to form on the leaves and on the ground, making the terrain slippery and treacherous. Without warning, a figure darted from the shadows ahead. Tall and gaunt, its limbs were too long, its movements jerky and unnatural as it darted between the trees. Jake barely caught a glimpse before it disappeared, but the sight was enough to chill his blood. It was human, or at least, it had once been human. Its eyes, devoid of any warmth or humanity, had fixed on him for a horrifying second before it vanished. Panic set in, and Jake realized he was lost. The path, if there ever had been one, was gone. He was deep in the heart of the forest, in the middle of nowhere, with something unimaginable lurking in the darkness. He tried to retrace his steps, but everything looked the same in the dim light of his flashlight. Branches seemed to grab at him, thorns tearing at his clothes and skin. Every noise made him jump, every shadow a potential threat. Then, ahead in the darkness, a light flickered. Not the natural glow of a firefly or the clear light of a flashlight, but a dull, throbbing blue light that pulsed in the distance. Intrigued despite himself, Jake headed toward it. As he approached, the light grew brighter, revealing a small, dilapidated cabin almost completely overtaken by the forest. Vines crawled up its sides, and the windows were dark, glass broken and scattered on the ground. The light emanated from inside, shining through the gaps in the walls and the broken windows. Jake approached the cabin cautiously, his heartbeat echoing in his ears. He pushed open the door, the hinges groaning loudly in the quiet forest. Inside, the source of the light became clear, a single, old-fashioned oil lamp burned on a rough wooden table, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The cabin was filled with odd trinkets and symbols, bones hanging from the ceiling, and strange carvings etched into the walls. A heavy book lay open on the table, its pages filled with arcane writings and dark illustrations. It was a place of ritual, of old, forgotten things. Suddenly, the temperature dropped, breath visible in the air. Jake felt a presence behind him, heavy and oppressive. He turned slowly, flashlight trembling in his hand. There, standing in the doorway, was the gaunt figure he had seen in the woods, its eyes glowing faintly blue in the dim light. Jake stepped back, knocking over the lamp. The cabin plunged into darkness, and the figure advanced, its movements quick and jerky. Jake fumbled for his flashlight, managing to turn it on just as the figure reached for him. The light seemed to startle it, causing it to hiss and retreat back into the shadows. Breathing heavily, Jake backed away towards the entrance, not taking his eyes off the place where the figure had disappeared. He knew he needed to escape, to get out of the forest and back to civilization. But as he turned to run, he found himself face to face with not one, but several of the creatures, all emerging from the shadows, encircling him, their eyes glowing ominously as they moved in. Movements were synchronized in a disturbing, predatory ballet, their steps silent despite the crunch of the underbrush beneath them. The faint glow from their eyes was the only light now, casting ghostly blue hues on their emaciated faces. Jake's flashlight, once a beacon of safety, now seemed woefully inadequate. He knew he couldn't run, the creatures encircled him too closely. Desperation clawed at his mind, urging him to find a way out. He remembered the old oil lamp he had knocked over. With a swift motion, he dove towards the table, groping in the dark until his hands found the cold metal of the lamp. He shook it, hoping for a remaining whisper of oil. The creatures drew closer, their hissing breaths filling the air. Jake struck the flint, and a small flame sputtered to life, casting eerie shadows across the cabin. He held the lamp aloft like a warding talisman. The creatures recoiled slightly, the light revealing the grotesque details of their decayed visage, skin pulled taut over protruding bones, lips tattered, eyes hollow yet luminous. Using the momentary reprieve, Jake backed towards the door, his eyes locked on the beings. Each step was a gamble, each breath a challenge. As he reached the threshold of the cabin, a cold gust of wind blew from the woods, extinguishing the lamp's flame and plunging him back into darkness. His breaths came out in visible puffs in the cold air as panic set in. He could hear them moving in the darkness, encroaching on his space, whispering in a language he could not understand. The door, his only barrier, felt flimsy against the malevolent force outside. With a burst of adrenaline, Jake dashed from the cabin, the icy night air slashing his lungs. He ran blindly into the forest, branches whipping against his face, roots threatening to trip him at every turn. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, leaving him with only the faint glow of his dying flashlight to guide him. Behind him, the sounds of pursuit grew. Twigs snapped and leaves rustled with the urgency of their chase. Jake pushed his body beyond its limits, fear lending speed to his flight. He could almost feel their breath on his neck, their fingers inches from grasping his coat. Suddenly, ahead in the darkness, a faint light beckoned. Jake's hope rekindled, and he surged towards it, lungs burning, legs aching. The light grew stronger, resolving into the shape of a lantern hanging from a low branch. Beneath it stood an old cabin, its door slightly ajar, a beacon of hope in the unyielding night. With the last of his strength, Jake reached the cabin and threw himself inside, slamming the door shut behind him. He fumbled for a lock, a bar, anything to secure the door, but found nothing. Instead, he pushed a heavy wooden table against it, its legs scraping loudly against the floor. Panting, Jake looked around. The cabin was sparsely furnished, with only a few pieces of decrepit furniture and a cold fireplace. No decorations, no warmth, no signs of life. It was abandoned, or perhaps, a place forgotten by time itself. The only source of light was the lantern outside, its flickering glow casting unsettling shadows across the walls. Jake approached a window and peered out cautiously. The creatures had stopped at the edge of the clearing, their figures just visible in the dim light. They did not come closer, as if an unseen boundary held them at bay. They watched the cabin with their eerie, luminescent eyes, a silent vigil. As he watched them, a deeper chill settled over Jake. Why did they not enter? What was it about this place that kept them at bay? His gaze drifted around the cabin's interior, searching for clues. His flashlight beam caught on something in the fireplace, a small, charred object half buried in the ashes. Curiosity overcoming his dread, Jake knelt by the fireplace, reaching for the object. It was a book, its cover burnt, but its pages surprisingly intact. He opened it carefully, the pages crackling under his touch. The text was written in a flowing script he didn't recognize, interspersed with strange symbols and diagrams that sent shivers down his spine. Jake could not read the words, but he felt their power, an ancient and forbidding aura that permeated the air, thick as the mist outside. The book seemed to pulse with a life of its own, its secrets locked within the charred pages, waiting for someone, or something, to unlock them. Outside, the creatures remained, watching and waiting, as if they knew the book's power was the key to their salvation, or their damnation. And Jake, caught in the heart of this forgotten place, realized he was now part of this ancient and terrifying story. The cabin felt like a cage as much as a sanctuary. He flipped through the book, the flickering light from the lantern outside casting moving shadows that danced across the walls like specters. Each page turned was an audible whisper in the haunting silence that enveloped him. The symbols seemed to twist and writhe under his gaze, a language of darkness that beckoned even as it repelled. Outside, the creatures stirred, their movements synchronized with the turning of the pages, as if each revelation tied them closer to him, binding them with invisible threads to his fate. With every chapter unfolded, the wind howled louder, a chorus of the damned that echoed through the trees, the very sound seeming to shake the foundations of the old cabin. Jake's mind raced with panic and fascination. He knew he should stop, that delving deeper into the book's mysteries was like peeling back the skin of the world to glance at the raw, pulsing chaos beneath. But the need to understand, to piece together the story of these woods, these creatures, and this cabin, drove him forward, deeper into the abyss. The lore within the pages spoke of an ancient curse, one that bound the spirits of those who had trespassed against sacred laws to the very soul of the forest. It spoke of a guardian, a keeper of balance, who held the power to either bind or release these souls with the help of the book. And as Jake read these words, a sinking realization dawned upon him. The keeper's spirit was tied to the cabin, and now, to him, as its latest inhabitant. His eyes lifted from the book as a cold draft swept through the cabin. The door rattled against the makeshift barricade, a slow, deliberate sound that was too purposeful to be the wind. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he watched, frozen, the shadows at the window shifting, coalescing into the outline of a face, the eyes glowing with that same eerie luminescence. "Release us," a voice whispered, not through the air but in his mind, a voice not one but many, layered and desperate. It was the creatures, their consciousness reaching out to him through the power of the book. Jake staggered back, the book clutched in his trembling hands. "What do you want from me?" he demanded, his voice cracking with fear. "To be freed," the voice answered, a symphony of sorrow and longing. "You hold the power now. Free us from our bonds, and we will grant you safe passage from these woods." The temptation was overwhelming. To be free of this nightmare, to walk out into the world of the living once more, Jake yearned for this. But as he gazed at the book, understanding dawned upon him. This was not just about release, it was about balance. Whatever had bound these creatures here had done so for a reason. To free them without understanding the consequences could unleash untold horrors upon the world. With a resolve forged in the fires of his fear, Jake spoke, "I will find a way to free you, but only if I can do it without bringing harm to the living. There must be another way, a right way." The whispering winds fell silent, as if considering his words. The face at the window faded back into the shadows, leaving Jake's hands trembled slightly as he continued to turn the pages, the ancient text revealing more about the darker presence lurking beyond the immediate threats he faced. The rituals detailed were complex, interwoven with warnings and tales of those who had attempted them before and failed. The air grew colder, and the cabin seemed to creak under the weight of an unseen force, as if it too was aware of the dark power stirring in the shadows of the forest. Outside, the darkness deepened, and the natural noises of the night grew silent, replaced by an oppressive stillness. The feeling of being watched intensified, and Jake could almost sense the malevolent gaze upon him, a scrutiny that was calculating, ancient, and profoundly evil. The creatures that surrounded the cabin, bound by ancient spells and suffering, shifted restlessly. Their eyes, aglow with a muted luminescence, focused on the cabin, reflecting a mixture of hope and terror. They knew, as did Jake, that the breaking of their curse could awaken something far more sinister than their own tormented spirits. As Jake delved deeper into the text, he found a marginal note, written in a shaky hand, warning of their guardian of the depths, a creature bound to the forest, the protector of its most sacred and darkest secrets. This guardian was the true power behind the curse, the keeper of balance, ensuring that the spirits did not escape and that no one dared to disturb the dark heart of the forest. With each word read, Jake felt the cabin grow colder, the shadows darker. An ominous rustling began to echo around the cabin, a sound like dry leaves being crushed underfoot, slowly circling the building. The rhythm was hypnotic, almost ritualistic, as if the very act of reading aloud from the book had become part of an unintended summoning. He paused, his instinct screaming for him to stop, to close the book and flee. But he knew it was too late for escape. His fate was intertwined with that of the spirits and the dark guardian of the woods. His only choice was to continue, to find a way to complete the ritual without unleashing the full wrath of the guardian upon himself and the world. Jake's voice faltered as he read the final incantation, the words seeming to resonate with the very walls of the cabin. As he spoke, the wind rose to a howl, and the trees bent as if in agony. A deep, resonant growling filled the air, a sound so powerful it vibrated through the floorboards, sending shivers up Jake's spine. Suddenly, the door shook violently, as if struck by an immense force. The wooden table barricading it groaned under the pressure, its legs scraping against the wooden floor. Jake backed away, his eyes wide with fear, as the ancient wood began to splinter and crack. He knew he had little time. Rushing to the book, he scanned the pages for anything that might help him strengthen the cabin's defenses. His hands found a passage describing a protective circle, a barrier of salt and ash that could hold against any entity drawn by the ritual. Jake's eyes scanned the cabin frantically for anything he could use. His gaze landed on the fireplace, where a bucket of ash sat beside a small pile of firewood. Wasting no time, he grabbed the bucket, spreading the ash in a white circle around him, murmuring another incantation from the book. He could feel the power of the words, a tingling sensation that raised the hairs on his arms. He then dashed to the kitchen area of the cabin, where he found a container of salt. Pouring it into his ash circle, he completed the barrier just as the door burst open with a thunderous crash. A shadow loomed in the doorway, large and imposing, its form obscured by the darkness. The guardian of the depths had come, drawn by the disruption of its domain. Its presence filled the cabin, a suffocating force that threatened to extinguish the very air. Jake stood his ground within the circle, clutching the book to his chest, his only shield against the encroaching darkness. The guardian moved closer, its form becoming clearer as it entered the dim light of the lantern. It was a grotesque amalgamation of tree and beast, limbs twisted like gnarled branches, eyes glowing with an unholy fire. It spoke in a voice that was the sound of rustling leaves and cracking wood, a voice that seemed to come from the earth itself. "You dare to bind what has been set free," it thundered, its voice echoing off the walls. Jake felt the cabin tremble with the power of the guardian's voice. He clutched the book tighter, knowing his response would determine his fate. The guardian loomed in the shattered doorway, its form a towering silhouette against the moonlit mist outside. Jake, encircled by his hastily drawn line of ash and salt, held the ancient book against his chest, its weight grounding him against the rising tide of fear. "I did not come to bind anyone," Jake called out, his voice steady despite the trembling of his hands. "I came to learn, to understand. But I will protect myself." The guardian's eyes, deep pools of fiery amber, fixed on him. The cabin creaked ominously as if the very wood sensed the danger and mourned its imminent demise. "You have unleashed what cannot be controlled," the guardian boomed. "The balance must be restored, or all shall suffer." Jake's mind raced. The book had spoken of balance, of a ritual that could appease the guardian and restore what had been disturbed. He flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the ancient script for the passage he had glimpsed earlier. "Wait," he shouted, the word echoing through the cabin as he found the passage. "There is a way to restore the balance. A ritual of offering and acceptance. Let me perform it. Let me fix what I have wronged." The guardian paused, its towering form still as the grave. The wind seemed to hold its breath, the forest silent. Then, in a voice like the groan of old trees bending in a storm, it spoke, "Proceed." Jake quickly set about preparing the ritual. According to the book, he needed elements from the forest itself to appease the guardian: a branch from an elder tree, soil from the base of the oldest mountain, and water from a spring untouched by sunlight. Thankfully, he had collected these items earlier from around the cabin, intrigued by their mention in the book and their supposed protective properties. He placed each item in front of him, forming a triangle. In the center, he laid a small mirror, a reflective surface to symbolize the visibility of truth and the reflection of actions. As he arranged the elements, he recited the incantation written in the book, his voice growing more confident with each word. The air inside the cabin thicked, charged with an energy that raised the fine hairs on Jake's arms. The guardian watched, its fiery eyes never leaving the ritual. The wind began to swirl around the cabin, a physical manifestation of the growing power within. As Jake spoke the final words of the ritual, he took a deep breath and placed his palms on the mirror. The mirror glowed faintly, a soft light emanating from its surface, reflecting not Jake's face but the visage of the forest itself, trees swaying, leaves rustling, and the sky lightening with the dawn. A profound silence fell. The guardian's form shimmered, the harsh lines softening, blending into the forest behind it. "You have restored the balance," it said, its voice now like the whisper of wind through leaves. "But remember, the forest watches. Do not disturb its peace again." With those final words, the guardian faded, becoming one with the trees, its presence retreating into the depths of the forest. The wind died down, and the first rays of sunrise pierced the darkness, casting golden light across the forest floor. Jake stood alone in the cabin, the weight of the book in his hands a reminder of the night's reality. He had come seeking stories, only to become part of one, a story of ancient guardians, restless spirits, and the thin veil between curiosity and recklessness. As he packed his belongings, including the now closed book, he knew his journey was not just about writing a new book but about respecting the mysteries that some places held. Some stories, he realized, were not just told, they were experienced, they were survived. With a last look at the cabin and the forest that had tested him to his limits, Jake walked back towards the village, the morning light guiding his way. Behind him, Whispering Pines resumed its usual whisper, a soft murmuring of leaves that could be a farewell or a warning, a sound that Jake would carry with him for the rest of his life. The story of Whispering Pines was complete, yet the forest's watchful eyes lingered in the shadows, a haunting reminder that some places hold secrets too deep for the daylight to reveal. As Jake made his way back to the village, the early morning mist clung to the ground, swirling around his feet. The village of Whispering Pines, now just emerging in the distance, seemed to watch him approach, its windows like wary eyes, cautious and observing. Despite the ordeal being over, a chill continued to trace his spine, reminding him that the peace was perhaps only temporary, the quiet, a delicate truce. When Jake finally reached the village diner, the few early risers turned to look at him, their eyes a mixture of curiosity and something deeper, perhaps recognition or respect. He realized then that the village and its people were part of the forest's lore just as much as any spirit or guardian. They lived with these stories, guarding them, perhaps even fearing them. Sitting down at the counter, the same elderly woman who had served him coffee before slid a cup towards him without a word. This time, the coffee seemed to carry more weight, a shared understanding between them. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, her voice soft but carrying an edge of seriousness. "I've seen more than I bargained for," Jake replied, taking a cautious sip. "But I think I've set things right." The woman nodded, as if she had expected nothing less. You might have, she conceded, but remember, some things don't like to be set right. They prefer the chaos. Jake considered her words, the gravity of his actions settling in. He had walked into the heart of an ancient story, one that had thrived on its own terms, undisturbed by the outside world. He had stirred the depths, and though he had managed to restore balance, he knew that the line he walked was thin and precarious. Leaving the diner, Jake felt the gaze of the village on his back. As he drove out of Whispering Pines, the sun broke through the trees in streaks of gold, illuminating the path ahead. The forest seemed to stand watch, its silence no longer threatening but solemn, a guardian of deep and powerful secrets. The drive back to the city was long and gave Jake plenty of time to reflect. His experiences had changed him, altering not just his perception of the natural world but of himself. He had sought a story, and in turn, the story had revealed truths not just about the world but about his own spirit and resilience. Arriving home, Jake sat down to write. His typewriter clicked rhythmically, each letter embedding the tale of Whispering Pines into the fabric of reality. He wrote of the guardian, the spirits, and the ancient rites that bound them. He wrote of the forest, alive and whispering, and of the people who lived in its shadow. He wrote of his fear, his determination, and ultimately, his respect for the balance of things unseen. When the book was finally published, it was received with a mixture of awe and disbelief. Readers were captivated by the vivid descriptions, the palpable tension, and the unsettling peace that the story conveyed. Scary middle-of-nowhere horror stories you won't believe became more than just a title. It became a testament to the thin veil that separates our world from the ones we dare not understand. Jake often thought about returning to Whispering Pines, drawn by the haunting beauty and the mysteries it held. But some part of him knew that he had left part of himself there, in the heart of the forest, and that was enough. He had crossed a threshold from which one does not entirely return. As years passed, the story of Whispering Pines remained, a chilling reminder of the darkness that dwells just beyond the light, watching, waiting, ever present. It stood as a beacon to the curious and the brave, a call to those who walk the line between the known and the unknown, who seek to unearth the stories that are whispered in the shadows of the world.